Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Kavita Mehra, and I am the Executive Director of Saki for South Asian Women. We are a survivor-led, survivor-centered gender justice organization serving the South Asian diaspora in New York City for 32 years. Tonight is the first in a series of events highlighting Saki's spring campaign, Isolated but Not Alone, Emerging with Hope. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we saw the marked rise of gender-based violence and knew as one public health epidemic was taking shape in our consciousness, a silent pandemic was on the rise. In an effort to lift up the voices and experiences of survivors, Saki launched its Isolated but Not Alone campaign in 2020. And we are continuing to build on last year's momentum through our 2021 campaign, Emerging with Hope. This evening, we are honored to have two inspiring storytellers with us, Alisha Haridasani Gupta of the New York Times, engaging in an intimate conversation with Tanya Selvaratnam, writer, artist, and producer. Alisha Haridasani Gupta is a gender reporter covering politics, business, technology, health, and culture through the gender lens for the New York Times, and also writes the In Her Words newsletter. She has covered, among many issues, inequality in the boardroom, the gendered ramifications of Brexit, the diversity of the Oscars, the biases programmed into AI technology, and more recently, how COVID-19 is impacting women. Tanya Selvaratnam is a writer and an Emmy-nominated and multiple Webby-winning producer. She is the Senior Advisor, Gender Justice Narratives at the Pop Culture Collaborative. She is the author of The Big Lie and Assume Nothing, A Story of Intimate Violence. Her essays have been published in The New York Times, Vogue, Glamour, Cosmo, CNN, NBC News, and McSweeney's. Thank you, Alisha and Tanya, for being with us this evening. If at any point during this conversation you experience any anxiety, discomfort, or any other intense emotions, please feel free to step back or step away. We also encourage you to check out our wellness guide, a community mental health resource developed by our team at Saki. The link for that will be in this chat. And if this conversation brings up anything that you'd like to share with a Saki advocate, please reach out to us at 212-868-6741. So without further ado, let's jump in.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining. And thank you, Kavita, for that introduction. In January 2018, Tanya Selvaratnam went to the editor of the New Yorker magazine with a bombshell story. Her ex-boyfriend had abused her when they were together. Her ex-boyfriend at that point was the New York Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, and he was praised for championing women's rights and taking on Harvey Weinstein. That same man, the Me Too hero, had abused Tanya behind closed doors. She was told that the magazine would investigate. A few months later, the New Yorker published her story alongside 3 other women who had also experienced abuse by Mr. Schneiderman. The journalists found a pattern that Schneiderman would get physically violent with these women, often in a sexual context, but without their consent, and he would psychologically abuse them too, tracking their whereabouts, controlling what they wore or how they dressed, and even what they ate. 3 hours after the story published, Schneiderman resigned. And last week, after an investigation by the Justice Department, a court suspended his law license for a year. Intimate partner violence is one of the biggest threats American women face today. About 1 in 3 women in the US has experienced physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking victimization by an intimate partner in her lifetime. That number is far higher for women of color. And as Kavita mentioned, it surged during the pandemic. I'm so honored to have Tanya here with us today to share her story so that it can help other survivors find a way out. Tanya, thank you.
Thank you, Alisha. I'm so honored to be interviewed by you.
Oh, no. Could you give the audience an arc of how your relationship with Eric Schneiderman unfolded, right from the moment you met him in 2016 and then up to the point where you realized you had to get out?
We met in Philadelphia at the Democratic National Convention. I could sense that someone was looking at me, and we exchanged glances, and then he approached me. When we started speaking, it was quite a nerdy flirtation. We discussed how we had both gone to Harvard, we had both studied Chinese, and he said to me, "You're writing notes." Most other people were on their laptops or phones, but I had pen and paper. And then he asked if I knew who he was, and I didn't. He asked where I lived, and I said, New York. And he said, then I'm your lawyer. He was the Attorney General of New York State. But what impressed me most was that he was interested in meditation and spirituality, which I had been interested in for many years. And I was surprised that a politician meditated. So that was the fairy tale period, and it felt too good to be true. But then the darkness started to seep in. The things that he had found appealing and intriguing about me in the early days suddenly became the opposite. For example, he would look at my scars on my torso from cancer surgery as if they were a badge of courage, and then he wanted me to get plastic surgery to remove them. My Sri Lankanness, my foreignness, suddenly he belittled me in ways that were flat out racist, criticizing my hair, that it looked too wild, calling me his slave. My friends, whom he found fascinating, suddenly they were referred to by him as ditzes and clueless. So in the book, I take the reader through the steps that I went through to get entangled in an abusive relationship, which was most starkly characterized by the physical violence in the sexual context. And I apologize in advance that this will be triggering for many, but the slapping and choking and spitting that he inflicted on me during sex, never with my consent, the entrapment, the isolation, the coercive control, and the physical violence. I knew that I had to get out when a friend asked me, who sensed that things were not right with me. She asked, does he hit you? After asking me a number of other questions about what was going on in the relationship. And I said yes. And it was at that moment that I knew I had to get out, and she connected me with a domestic violence expert who helped me understand that what I had gone through was classic domestic violence, and that I had to be kind of unbrainwashed and focused on my physical safety.
So, I mean, it's so disturbing the ways that he controlled you, as you describe in the book, and you hit on it just now. You know, he told you to wear heels. He wanted your hair a certain way. He even controlled what you ate. So in those moments when you were going through them, before your friend asked you, did you realize what was happening?
By the time the darkness seeped in, he had broken me down so much that there were times when I recognized the harm that he was causing, and there were other times when, because I had been so gaslit, I didn't. Some of the ways in which he tried to control me seemed less harmful, asking me to dress a certain way, asking me to do my hair a certain way. He wanted me to look like first lady material. The other ways, like wanting me to get a boob job, wanting me to get my scars removed through plastic surgery, those seemed more harmful. But abusers are very skilled at customizing the abuse to their prey. And as I would later find out, he did customize his abuse for every one of his victims. And so I was one in a line of many I would eventually discover.
And at this time when you were together, he was sort of painted as this heroic figure. He was taking on Weinstein. He was seen as like women's rights champion. What was that troubling for you to watch that sort of public persona and then the darkness at home, the two dichotomies?
Nothing surprises me about the bifurcation of powerful people. But what was especially stark about the contrast between the light and dark in my abuser was that he was not only publicly facing a good guy doing good work, but he was a hero of the Me Too movement. He was an advocate for women's rights and vulnerable communities. And most shocking, he had co-authored some of the legislation on strangulation. While he publicly, was doing this good work, he privately was choking his girlfriends.
What do you think psychologically, or like what's happening behind the scenes when someone can be so bifurcated like that? Like, have you looked into the psychology behind it? Why does that happen? Or how can that happen?
It's the conditioning by the patriarchy that normalizes this kind of violence. The safety of women is a threat to male power. And it's the conditioning of men to dominate over women. It's the power over culture in general, scarcity versus abundance, and hoarding resources and wealth and power rather than the equitable distribution of it. So it's very much about control and power.
And so you think like the public admiration of him sort of fed into his power. It's part of his narcissism, and that the public was maybe willing to turn a blind eye toward what he was doing at home. Did people know what he was doing before you came out?
Most people did not know what he was doing, but there were many people who did. I mean, aside from previous ex-girlfriends, there were also people who had been aware about his abusive behavior. And I had to fight very hard against the disappointment that nobody warned me. And it made even more firm my decision to come forward so that he didn't do it to other women, so that they don't have the memories that I have.
Yeah.
And I think if you watch movies like Wild Wild Country, the series about the Rajneeshis and how normal, rational people can be brainwashed to do completely lunatic acts. I feel that the cults of personality that form around powerful or rich or talented people are very harmful to the people who are in those cults and very harmful to society. And I feel like it's a collective project to try and dismantle those cults of personality, and also to take away the pedestals and have these abusive men and abusive people in general removed, because they won't cede power. And when they feel their power being taken away, they're going to fight even harder, use any strategy or means they can to preserve it. So it's really up to the people to rise up against them.
In my conversations and in my research with domestic violence advocates, they always say that they ask survivors what they want. Do they want a restraining order? Do they want a public apology? Do they want cash settlement? What is it? When you decided to come forward, did you know what you wanted?
I wanted to do what was most strategic to achieving my goals, which were to warn other women about him, to prevent him from harming other women. And also, I felt strongly that an abuser should not be the Attorney General of New York State. That was not the primary objective, but it certainly was part of why I came forward. I explored many legal pathways to achieving that result. I explored filing an ethics complaint, a civil claim. I explored filing a police report. But because my abuser was the top law enforcement officer in New York State, all those legal pathways led to him. And so ultimately, I decided on the court of public opinion. It was also at a moment, because my story was unfolding in real time as the Me Too movement was ascending, that there was more attention on stories of abuse. And I saw that the impact that these stories had because of the courageous work of journalists and editors. And that's when I spoke with David Remnick of the New Yorker.
Yeah, and you hit on this earlier. He called you a slave, and your identity played into his form of control. And even coming forward as a woman of color is extremely dangerous. This legal system doesn't help women, and definitely doesn't help women of color get justice in whatever that means for them. So what was your so when you mentioned you went, you looked into all these different legal pathways, did you already face that resistance? Was being a woman of color sort of feeding into your decision?
I was scared about coming forward in general, not just as a woman of color. I was uncomfortable participating in the process of the investigation, but I also knew that I had to do the right thing and support that process. I also felt that, I had to fight against irrational fear by people who didn't want to come forward against him. And when I say irrational fear, for me, I felt people's attention spans are short, news cycles pass, and that I would eventually be able to get on with my life. Also, I had to go to work. I had to keep up with my working life. And I was very fortunate and grateful to have a community of friends and supporters around me who kept me moving forward. Without them, I couldn't have done that.
When that New Yorker article went online, and then 3 hours later he resigned, what was going through your mind? Did you expect him to resign so quickly?
I had no idea how the story was going to land, and I had prepared myself for multiple outcomes. I had prepared myself for the story not to land well, and I had made plans to leave the country, which I did a day and a half later. I was supposed to be out of the country when the story did land, but then they accelerated its coming out because there started to be leaks that an investigation was happening. But I had already moved out of my apartment and into a friend's place, and so nobody knew where I was. I was inaccessible. I had also made a decision before the story came out not to do any follow-up press because I thought, let the story speak for itself. And if I needed to, in case it didn't land well, then I might have participated in follow-up press. But I was shocked when within 3 hours, he did resign, and I felt my shoulders go down. I felt like, okay, now the next phase, whatever that phase was going to be, could begin.
And are you surprised that he got disbarred last week? What are your thoughts on that?
So I had been participating in that investigation for the better part of the last almost 2 years. I had no idea when the ruling was going to happen. I am grateful to the investigators and to the Attorney Grievance Committee for having sent a strong message that egregious personal misconduct does impact one's ability to fulfill their duties. How do I feel about the 1-year suspension? And it also included monitored mental health counseling. That is not enough to outroot his abusive behavior or anyone's abusive behavior, but it is a step in the right direction. Also, it was based on, the ruling was based on the facts of that particular investigation, which involved 3 victims. But since the New Yorker story came out, I heard from 2 more previous victims. Since my book has come out, I've heard from another 2 previous victims. So I wonder if that might have impacted the outcome of this decision. But for now, I'm just grateful that it's done, that I don't have to think about it. I was shocked that it came out after my book came out, and also during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I mean, that was extraordinary.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned earlier just now that personal conduct impacts the way you, you can be attorney general, or, your professional public life. And that kind of hits on something that, that is maybe the reason why intimate partner violence is so widespread is because it's considered personal, private, and nothing to do with the government or law enforcement. It's sort of shrouded in secrecy. People don't want to come out talking about it, particularly in the South Asian community. I mean, there's so much wariness around coming forward, and especially in your book, you mentioned that your mother was also abused by your father. So talk to me about why there is this sort of normalization of intimate partner violence and that intergenerational trauma. Did it sort of like, was it at the back of your mind when you were coming forward?
I feel that more people have to share their stories of experiencing violence so that we take the shame and the stigma out of them. The outpouring of notes from people, strangers and friends, who've also experienced intimate partner violence has been at times overwhelming, but and moving, and also makes me very sad, because it is this violence is so pervasive.
Yeah.
And the pandemic has heightened its pervasiveness with the increases in domestic violence and intimate partner violence all around the world, because victims are in lockdown with their abusers. But I feel that by sharing our stories, we can chip away at that conditioning that results in us being born into trauma, and that trauma being passed down from generation to generation. In my mother's case, she endured domestic violence for decades. And I feel relatively fortunate's not the right word, but I suffered it for about a year. I had a community of friends and colleagues who supported me in getting out of it and then in coming forward. My mother did not have that support network. And so it's just really a sign, because that violence continues, and it continues generationally. I've had so many young people reach out to me to say that they've been assaulted 1, 2, 3 times. And it just breaks my heart. So I'm hopeful that by, opening up about this, that we can compel those in positions of political power to take more action.
How has your mother reacted to your book?
She hasn't read the book, and I told her not to. I think that I would hope that she is proud. The story was already out there, so she's already had to deal with being in the news cycle in Sri Lanka, which is where I'm from, in dealing with, there are people who are supportive of her, because part of her story is in my story too. It's so linked. I couldn't leave it out. Being a child who witnessed horrific domestic violence and then finding myself in the really shocking position of being a victim myself, which I never ever thought would happen to me. But so I feel, I regret that I got into the relationship and had this story to tell, but I hope that by telling it, that I can help others spot, stop, and prevent it from happening in their own lives and in the lives of their loved ones.
So why don't we talk about that? How can people come to realize, or even their support network come to realize that someone is in an abusive relationship?
Well, I hope that my book is full of resources, and there's an appendix with a checklist of how to spot the signs of abuse and the effects of the abuse, and recognizing that abuse is not only physical, it's also financial, verbal, legal, digital, emotional, and that there are many, many organizations like Saki that can help people. Because like with my friend who asked, does he hit you? She knew when I answered yes, that she was not equipped to take me from that step forward. And so she connected me with a domestic violence expert who did help me from that moment on. And what I would say to people who are in abusive relationships, you're not alone and you're not crazy, and there are organizations that can help you. And for people who know loved ones in abusive relationships, don't just stand by. Don't wait for your friend to open up. Be empathetic and sympathetic, be a good listener, ask questions, ask how they're doing, check in, because you never know when your friend might be ready to talk, which was what happened in my case.
Yeah. I mean, there was a part in the book where your friend, you know, kind of indicated that he seems a bit controlling. I think you received a phone call late at night and he's screaming at you, and she suggested, you know, maybe he's controlling, but then you let it slide, you know. And you know, I think for people within that moment, like you mentioned, it's hard to realize in that context, you know, sort of zooming out and seeing yourself there, what's going on. So what are some of like your checklist? What does it suggest? How do you recognize that there's been a line crossed?
It's hard when you're the person who is the victim to recognize while you're in it, because by the time you're entangled in it, you have been so broken down that it's like how the domestic violence expert described it to me. I needed to be unbrainwashed. And when the relationship did end in the fall of 2017, she said, now your unbrainwashing can begin. So it's not always possible for the victim to be able to recognize it. And this is where I hope that the checklist that's in the book of the signs, as I described early in our conversation, the coercive control, the entrapment, the isolation, in addition to the physical abuse, can help people recognize it more easily. And also those examples of, there were a number of friends in the book who noticed that something was wrong, who noticed that he was trying to control me in a way that just wasn't normal with regard to how I ate and dressed. That they were not reading between the lines because I wasn't talking about it, but many of them felt that they could have read between the lines because of what they were observing. And some of them expressed regret that they hadn't said something to me sooner. But thankfully, eventually, some of them did.
Yeah. You recently had another interview with David Remnick, I mean, around the publication of your book. And, you know, you mentioned that we are in a second wave of the Me Too movement. Can you explain for our audience what you meant by that?
The next wave is 3 parts. One is exposing intimate violence in committed relationships. Many of the Me Too stories were about workplace harassment, sexual assault. I feel exposing intimate violence in committed relationships, and we've seen that in the last few months in the stories of FKA Twigs and Evan Rachel Wood, exposing that kind of violence, because the violence that starts at home in these committed relationships often translates into violence committed by these perpetrators outside the home. Many of the mass shootings are committed by perpetrators of domestic violence. And so exposing that intimate violence in committed relationships is one part of Me Too. Another part is calling out the enablers, because the abusers don't get away with the abuse without the enablers around them. And in my situation, there were so many powerful enablers, and it's shocking. You know, we were talking about the bifurcation of abusers like Eric before. The bifurcation of the enablers is not surprising to me because I experienced it, but it's truly disillusioning and insidious because many of them were white feminists. I call them the female patriarchs. They are very prominent. They are very public, but they were trying to discredit me behind the scenes, and they were trying to discredit the reporting of Jane Mayer and Ronan Farrow, which was airtight. But their power was wrapped up in Eric Schneiderman's power, and they missed that conduit to power. And also the spiritual leaders that Eric was shielded by. The meditation teachers, who are also very public and very recognizable, they enabled him too. I don't feel anger at them because their actions don't surprise me. So I don't react, but I do feel like we need to expose them, and I'm looking forward to saying their names eventually. The third part of Me Too is encouraging bystanders to be upstanders. And what I mean by that, and we were talking about this earlier, like what can you do if you sense that your loved one is in an abusive relationship? To know that bystanders, and there's been so much talk about bystanders being upstanders because of the tragic increase in AAPI hate crimes, like how people just stood by while people have been beaten up and attacked and assassinated. And it is everyone's responsibility to stand up for the dignity and safety of everyone else and not just watch. And I think about the witnesses who have captured on their phones violence and been powerful, powerful tools in prosecuting cases of violence. And I feel like, so that's one way to go from being a bystander to an upstander, but also if you're a friend, to reach out to your loved one who you might think is in an abusive relationship and be an upstander for them. So we need more like upstander training.
Yeah, I mean that shooting in Atlanta, you know, people were saying it's sort of racial hatred, but it's also sexualized hatred. There was an element of both gender and racism at play there. So, I mean, like you said, the legal system is sort of all these hoops you jump through. There's, you know, you file a complaint and then you go, you know, the number of trials that result from that are so small. The number of convictions that result from them that are even smaller. Every step of the way, the number gets smaller. When you mentioned that you were being discredited behind the scenes. Was your race ever used against you? Was your outsider status used against you? How were you? What were some of the things that were used to discredit you?
Not my race, because the 3 other women who participated in the investigation were white. So there were multiple stories with eerily similar patterns in them. What was used to discredit me is that I was an opportunist, that I was seeking publicity. It's not exactly the kind of publicity I wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah. But now that the book is out, you know, I am doing more public conversations like this. I am doing publicity because I want people to discover the book, to read it, to share it, and to spread its message. And so, you know, now the publicity is helping give the message about intimate partner violence and how to prevent it a broader platform. So I'm grateful for opportunities like this one. But it was used to discredit me back then. And also it wasn't just to discredit me, they were vouching for his innocence, even when they knew that he had a pattern of abusive behavior.
Right. Yeah. There's just so much to unpack there. I wanted to bring in some questions from the audience, and then we can come back to some of the things you mentioned. This is a question from Shilpi. She says, "Thank you for your powerful words and courage, Tanya. You mentioned that, you know, it's the not so obvious forms of abuse that are truly difficult to recognize. Do you have any thoughts around spiritual abuse and how it can be damaging?"
Well, you know, in the book, I talk about how as stinging as the slaps were the forms of verbal abuse. And it's hard to get that type of abuse out of your head. It's something that I struggle with, even though less and less, to today. When somebody makes you feel so bad about yourself and makes you feel like you're you can't move without committing a transgression, it's a very hard conditioning to shake. And that's where the mental health counseling and organizations like Saki and the many, many domestic violence organizations around the country that cater to specific communities become so, so important to realize that we are all worthy of living a life of grace and dignity and living our best selves and converting that power over culture, which is very much about patriarchal domination, into power with culture, where we support each other and lift each other up. So it's really, I think by building communities, we can counter that type of verbal demeaning and spiritual demeaning and all the forms that are non-physical of abuse.
We have another question. So some person, I'm not sure who this is, but someone said it is important to realize that leaving can be dangerous. A survivor is sometimes often in more danger when they're leaving based on the one using violence. Because the person using violence can do whatever they want to regain control, especially in your case. I mean, he's the Attorney General of New York, was. So how can survivors overcome that fear of potentially facing more danger if they leave?
Well, the scariest time to get out of an abusive relationship and the most dangerous time for the victim is at that moment of the actual leaving. And the majority of domestic violence fatalities occur at that moment. Domestic violence incidences are the #1 reason to for calls to 911, but they're also one of the most underreported crimes. And I believe that many people stay in abusive relationships because of their fear of leaving, which is why it's so crucial to have domestic violence organizations and experts that provide pro bono services to various communities to spread those resources so that people know how to contact them and to create a safety plan for how to get out. And I was very fortunate to be connected through my friend to a domestic violence expert who helped me craft one. And even though abuse and violence is very, very common, with 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 men experiencing some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetimes, millions of them before they turn 18. Each case is unique. And so there's no one size fits all in terms of a safety plan. So I think it is absolutely vital to connect with organizations who know how to help craft that safety plan.
Yeah. I think one of the most, you hit on something that's one of the most, I personally feel is the most harmful question to ask a survivor is, why didn't you leave? Because it's not that easy. Even FKA Twigs was asked that, and she said, I had all the financial means in the world and I could not leave. I didn't feel safe to leave. I didn't feel I could leave. Another question is actually based on that. So much of the narrative, this is from Tracy Rector. She says so much of the narrative around intimate partner violence is centered around victim blaming. So how can we change that narrative to, from why don't you leave to why does he abuse you?
Well, there's a line in the book that is a riff on a poem by Muriel Rukeyser. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. And I encourage everyone, let's split the world open together. I feel that by sharing our stories, by making people more aware of what it's like to be a victim, and also a victim looks like all of us and abusers are of all stripes.
Yeah.
And that's how we can begin to chip away at the victim blaming. And while people get criticized for asking victims why they stayed, it was an important question for me to ask myself because it helped me, I think, write a better book so that I could convey to the reader what stages I went through to get entangled in the relationship in the first place, and also to excavate and heal the fractures within myself that made me vulnerable to the abuse. Because even though I had accomplishments, I had a great network, I was strong, I was also at a point in my life where I was weakened with regard to romance. I had come off of many years of dealing with health crises, divorce, multiple miscarriages, and my abuser was able to tap into those vulnerabilities.
How did you stay hopeful through all of this? How did you find light?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because even though the book is about a dark subject, it is full of light and also magic and healing and full of art. And I was able to stay hopeful because, and also to find joy. I mean, I believe that if you can feel the pain, you can feel the joy. And as a Sri Lankan, I love to dance. I love to have a good time. And I am really grateful to my friends, to my work, and to my art. I'm so thankful that I'm an artist and that I could take the terrible things that happened to me, both with this book and my last book, and turn them into art. You know, I say, when life throws you lemons, make art. So that's how I found hope.
Mm. And this actually brings us to the next question from another viewer. Someone is asking, again, I can't see the name, but someone is asking, you know, what the word survivor means to you versus victim.
I believe that we can go from being victims to survivors to thrivers. So for me, it's getting to thriver that is the most important step to take.
That is such a beautiful answer.
Well, yeah, in the book, I take the reader through that journey. You know, I say that I wrote myself out of the darkness and that my friends kept me looking up. There's a moment when things were especially dark, when my thoughts were dark, I was isolating myself. And I said to a friend, the bad guys always win. And she said to me, but the storytellers also win.
That's nice. That's such an encouraging sentiment. You know, I want to get back to some of the dangers of that survivors might feel in leaving. What were you most scared of? I mean, it's, of course, given that he's a powerful man, but what was your safety plan like? What were you scared of?
I was scared that he would come after me because he could deploy very high level, high powered resources to come after me. And so my safety plan included drifting, getting out of the relationship as quietly as possible and not letting him know what I was thinking. There was no anger, there was no argument, no conflict. I just started drifting. And my safety plan also included making sure that when I did get my things from his place, that I went with a friend, that I made sure he wasn't going to be there, and to get out of there as quickly as possible. There were many times over the few months after the relationship ended when he would reach out to me. He wanted to get together with me. He wanted to talk to me. He would grow increasingly agitated if I didn't respond to him right away, either by phone or by email. And even though it would trigger shaking, really debilitating shaking when that would happen, I was very grateful that I had the domestic violence expert that I could reach out to and say, how do I deal with this? And so she really helped me navigate those months
Mm,
afterwards when I still hadn't decided to come forward, but just
mm,
was focused on recovering and brainwashing myself and getting on with my life and being able to look back at it at some point and say, that was a difficult time, but I've been through difficult times before, and I would move past it. And also, I think, being from Sri Lanka, being South Asian, where so many of our relatives and people back in our countries have dealt with really horrific violence, war, what's happening now in South Asia. I like, my heart breaks for those who are in inescapable situations. And I'm very grateful that I had a situation I could escape from. And thankfully, I had people to support me in that.
yeah. You mentioned recovering, before coming forward. What did that look like? Was it spiritual? Were you, you know, meditating? What were you making art? What was that recovery process like?
I was doing all of that, everything you described. I meditate every day. I've been meditating for more than 9 years now. And I started when I was first diagnosed with cancer in 2012 with 2 different types of cancer. And so it was just helping me kind of deal with the roller coaster of figuring out what it was that was wrong with me and dealing with the surgery. And it's something that I've continued. And there's ample evidence now on the positive psychological effects of meditation. And I meditate for anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes per day at least. And also taking walks. I love going for walks and losing myself in nature, getting outside. And also my friends help a lot, and ongoing therapy.
Hmm. So in the spirit of creating art, Tracy has another question for you. She used her personal experience as a survivor to produce a film to raise awareness. So she's asking you, particularly because Hollywood depicts domestic violence in a not so authentic way. She's wondering if you're planning to turn your story into a film.
Thank you, Tracy, for asking that question. The book has been optioned by ABC Signature Disney Television with Joanna Coles executive producing. That is public, and there will be some very exciting news made more public soon. I did not seek out it being turned into a series. I am very grateful that it will be, because it'll help spread the message of the book to an even wider audience. And as I've said, the book, although it's about a dark subject, it is full of magic and healing and light. So I hope that it is also inspiring to others to help them find their light as well. It's been described as a psychological thriller. I didn't set out to write a psychological thriller, but I wrote the events as they unfolded, and I'm excited to see how it translates to the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I read it, and it definitely reads like a thriller. It's very gripping. I couldn't put it down. I read it in like 3 days.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, it's I shouldn't say it in a good way, because this is your life. You lived through that terrible traumatic time, but you did a really good job in turning that into something powerful.
Well, I say, not only did he mess with the wrong woman and the wrong woman of color, but he messed with a storyteller and a documentary filmmaker. Like,
Right.
I'm an intrepid note taker and documentarian. So I had so much evidence. I had so much corroboration. I had been taking notes the whole time. I even had recordings of him that I had made, because I had talked to him about making a memoir. And in those recordings, he reveals quite a lot as well, not about what he did to me, but about his psychology and the roots of his conflict, which was the deep animus between his parents and the deep animus between himself and his mother.
You know, if we zoom out, the abuse you experienced happened during the Me Too movement. During the Me Too movement. But at that same time, we also had President Trump in the White House. And now we have several allegations against Governor Cuomo. So, you know, is it like 2 steps forward, 1 step back? What are your thoughts on that?
I think each of the sets of allegations against the former president, against Governor Cuomo, and other politicians and Eric Schneiderman, they're very different in nature, but the common thread between them, should the facts be proven true in any of them, is there's this thread of power and the way in which power facilitates abuse. I think that abusers in positions of power inflict harm on their victims because they think it's their right, because they think they can get away with it, because they think that no one will tell on them. I was completely taken by surprise at the convergence of the release of my book, which was the day, like in the same week that the Cuomo allegations came out. I couldn't believe the convergence. But I think that it's also part of the universe kind of intending for this convergence to happen so that we can start to have more conversations about it. I do feel that we are in a moment of opportunity, but we have to make sure that those opportunities don't subside to address gender-based violence. Thankfully, the White House and the current administration does prioritize addressing these issues of gender equity and gender-based violence, that there's now a White House office on gender policy. So we have those opportunities, but we have to keep up the drumbeat because political will is likely to subside as we get closer to the end of this year and as we get closer to election cycles, when politicians might feel they need to be more safe with regard to their political decisions and thereby sacrifice the safety of all.
And if you had not come forward, Schneiderman would have been in charge of investigating Cuomo. Is that correct?
Yes, I shudder to think of what that might have been like. It would have been an inherently compromised investigation.
Right.
I am grateful that Letitia James was elected to replace Eric Schneiderman. That is a sign of progress, and also to have somebody who really deserves to be Attorney General and is doing a phenomenal job without seeking the attention for it. You know, Eric Schneiderman was very good at getting attention for his work. He was presenting himself as a bulwark against the former administration, as being his hero of the Me Too movement. You know, it was as much about the fame as it was about doing the job. And so I'm very grateful that we don't have the circus that would have been sure to ensue if Eric Schneiderman had been the one overseeing the investigation of Governor Cuomo, because Governor Cuomo and Eric Schneiderman, in the same way that Eric Schneiderman and the former president, they all have dirt on each other. And they would have used it against each other, either admittedly or not admittedly, to compromise the investigations.
You know, you mentioned earlier all of the stuff that Schneiderman was doing publicly, you know, for women's rights, which was why he was painted as this champion. Do you believe he was just doing it for political reasons, or, you know, did he really believe, was he like so split personality that he really believed in those causes, but only until it, you know, reached his doorstep, that sort of thing? Or was it opportunistic?
I think it's both. I think while I'm not religious, I consider myself agnostic, and I believe that some people are guided by both good and evil, by both an angel and a devil. And I think that in his case, I think he might have, on the one hand, genuinely wanted to do good work. He wanted to align himself with the progressives. Part of him was progressive, but on the other hand, that public-facing good work was a form of deflection. And this is something that we see time and time again. Jeffrey Epstein being the most egregious example of that, wanting to do public-facing good work, his support of feminist causes, of scientific research, but it being this really diabolical cover for the dozens and dozens of girls and young women that he preyed on and abused. And speaking of calling out the enablers, Ghislaine Maxwell being the most egregious example of an enabler. And in my case, Jennifer Cunningham, Eric's ex-wife, being a dire enabler of him.
Is that the first time you've gone on the record with that name?
No, because it's in the book. So if
Okay.
people read the book, they will hear more about what was happening. But I haven't named publicly the other names that I know around Jennifer Cunningham who were also trying to discredit me, but I'm working my way up to that.
That's such a brave.
There's an amazing section in there where I refer to a friend of mine who's a reporter at the New York Times who tells me about the discrediting that was going on behind the scenes. And I reached out to her when I was writing the book to ask if I could mention her and what she told me. And she said, Tanya, it's true. So I was very grateful that she said yes. I don't mention her name. She's referred to anonymously, but that scene in the book.
It's so brave of you to not only take him down, but also his enablers. That's very inspiring that you want to, keep going through all of this discrediting, jumping through all these hoops, being sort of thoroughly questioned and investigated. That must take so much mental and emotional energy.
Well, it's not so much about courage than conscience for me. And also just understanding the way in which power corrupts and enables, and how insidiously it operates in this society and in the systems that we've been forced to operate within. And it's going to take a lot of work to get to a true power culture where we power with each other and stop powering over each other and start seeing ourselves in collaboration with each other rather than in competition with each other. And as far as like the risks that I took, I figured if things went badly for me that I would leave the country, move to another state where people wouldn't care as much. I was prepared to do that, but I had faith. And again, that's where I'm so grateful for my friends and for my colleagues who assured me that I could still work. And again, so many people stay in violent situations and conceal their truths because they don't have the support that I had. And I'm very acknowledging that I had a support network. And I just hope that the organizations like Saki receive more support so that they can provide more support to victims and survivors.
When you came forward to the New Yorker, did you ever feel, I think I get this feedback a lot, and I see it a lot happening on social media, that journalists hold a lot of power with survivor stories. It's ultimately up to us once you come forward to vet and tell that story in the most authentic way possible. And of course, biases seep in. Journalists are humans too. Did you feel nervous about that? Were you scared that the New Yorker might come back and say, sorry, we're not going to do anything with this?
I trusted David Remnick, and I wanted to speak with him and convey that I was willing to participate if the New Yorker pursued an investigation. But I also knew that it wasn't guaranteed. And so I prepared myself for multiple outcomes if the story didn't come out, in the same way I prepared myself for multiple outcomes for if it did come out. But deep down, I knew that it was eventually going to come out, because within a month of my having parted ways with Eric Schneiderman, I discovered that there had been a woman almost a decade before me who had also been abused by him. And I thought, if there's me and there's her, there have to be others. And because of the tenor of that moment, with Me Too stories happening and with other politicians and people in positions of power being exposed, I felt that the story was going to come out eventually. And I trusted David Remnick and also Jane Mayer and Ronan Farrow implicitly.
Yeah.
I knew that I was in very good hands, and I also knew that the story was out of my hands. And I knew that I couldn't control any aspect of the story. And in fact, I didn't even read the story until many hours after it came out.
Mm. Did you, I mean, we talked about your first reaction, but sort of, were you surprised that there were other women who sort of had the same experience?
I knew the details of my own story in the fact-checking
Yeah.
process, but I did not know the details of the other women's stories. And to see them side by side, and now to have heard from these multiple other women since that story came out.
Yeah.
One woman needed surgery for an injury he caused, and that was 40 years ago. It gives me chills thinking about it. But I had a friend who texted me after the story had come out and said, you can read it and not feel shame. And then eventually I did read it later that night.
That's a good friend who reads it for you first.
Yeah.
That's a good friend. We got a question from Amelia Hussein. She's a survivor of abuse in both a childhood setting and in a committed relationship. She's asking, do you ever struggle with internal voices of self-blame, self-frustration? Do you ever blame yourself, basically, because she has felt that even though she knows that her abuser is fully accountable and responsible, she still feels moments where she feels, some part of her is responsible. She blames herself sometimes. The voice comes back, she says. And she's still working on addressing this, but she wanted to know how you challenge that internal voice.
I encounter the self-blame almost every day, but and I speak this way about the symptoms of PTSD too. You can prepare yourself for when those moments arrive, because they do arrive out of nowhere usually, but you can prepare yourself for how you react to that. And this is where I credit my friends, my art, meditation, which really has helped me kind of build up the ability to note those moments of when I'm feeling triggered, when I'm feeling the self-blame, when I'm hearing those negative voices, and also through mental health counseling, which, as I mentioned, is ongoing for me. And I think it's also very, very important to tell people what you need. Don't keep it to yourself. That is a very hard thing to do, because we live in an aspirational society where we feel like we always have to put the positive spin, and social media has just exacerbated that madness. But we should be able to share with our friends when we're having a hard time, and to ask for what we need, and really seek out moments of joy. there's been a lot of research about the effects of music and art on our psychology. And so I want to encourage more kind of art therapy. And art therapy it doesn't mean like a practice, but it's about really just being able to engage with art and the world around you so that you can feel joy.
That's beautiful. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
So my earphones have died, so I'm just gonna take them off. 1 second.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay. Sorry about that. It just died randomly. Okay. So we have 2 more questions and then we can close out. Aparna says, what advice would you give to other survivors who might want to come forward to the media? How should they be prepared for that?
Well, coming forward to the media is, I would say, not every story of abuse will be covered by the media, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
In my situation, I recognize that it attracted a lot of media because I was involved with a public figure. But for most victims of abuse,
Yeah.
they are not public figures that are going to be covered in the media. And so what's most important for survivors is if it's not coming forward to the media because you're not dealing with a public figure as an abuser, it's more about focusing on your personal safety and also your healing and recovery. And this is where being able to open up to friends and loved ones and to experts and counselors who can help is, for me, the most important part. In my case, I had to come forward to the media because I was dealing with a public figure, and I had an opportunity to expose his insidious behavior. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. So one more final thought / question. It's from Tracy. She says, I'd love to see you create a hashtag to connect Me Too to domestic violence. You know, the second wave, as you mentioned. Do you have a hashtag?
Well, the hashtag is the hashtag for the book, Assume Nothing, which I think says a lot.
Yeah. Is that something he said to you, or I remember reading that he said something like that to you, right?
Yeah.
Where does the title come from?
So I had the title before I had the book, because Assume Nothing was a phrase that he often said to me to make me skeptical of people, to make me skeptical of my decisions, my actions. He would say, assume nothing, and he would say, trust no one. So those were ways of entrapping and isolating me. And so in naming the book Assume Nothing, it has many implications. One is a reframing and subverting of the language he used to silence me. And it's also assume nothing because, again, a victim looks like all of us, and even fierce women get abused.
Right. I mean, that's so clever to turn his phrase on him. Very clever. So
my mother would be very proud that you called me clever.
Oh gosh, come on. At this point, come on. Okay, so I think that's all the time that we have for questions. As we come to an end, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and to you, Tanya, for sharing your story so candidly, and for your thoughts, and for helping other survivors. I hope your words will inspire others. I want to remind folks that this event, in addition to creating this space for candid conversation on the often underreported experiences of intimate partner violence, intends to draw attention to Saki's Emerging with Hope campaign. You can donate to Saki's survivor-centered work at bit.ly/emergingwithhope. That link will also be shared in the chat. Thank you, Kavita, Shana, Veda, and Varsha, who have been working behind the scenes, for your time and energy. Finally, if you or a loved one is looking for support from Saki, please reach out to them at 212-868-6741, or you can visit their website, saki.org. Thank you.
And can I say one thing? Thank you, Alisha, for this provocative conversation, getting me to say things that others haven't gotten me to say. It's so important, the work you do and the work that Saki does. There was a question in the chat, how do I get the book outside the US? The book is available worldwide. Harper Books is the publisher. They have worldwide rights. So just look on kind of global bookseller websites. I know that friends in the UK have gotten it, in Australia, in Sri Lanka, I know that they're selling it. So it's at the moment, it's only in English, but it is available. And if you just search for Assume Nothing on various websites, including on the HarperCollins website, hopefully that will direct you. It does direct you to different places where you can buy the book.
Thank you.